He was never elected to anything. Not mayor, not governor, not president. He ran for governor once in 1934 and lost badly. And yet for nearly half a century, one man shaped New York City more than any elected official in its history. He built 13 expressways, 416 miles of parkways, 658 playgrounds, 150,000 housing units, Lincoln Center, Shea Stadium, the United Nations headquarters, and the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. His name was Robert Moses, and depending on who you ask, he was either the greatest builder in American history or the man most responsible for destroying the American city. The truth, as always, is more complicated, but the complications matter enormously because the choices Moses made in New York became a template for cities across the country. Understanding him means understanding why so many American cities still look the way they do today. Robert Moses was born in 1888 to a wealthy family in New Haven, Connecticut. He studied at Yale, then Oxford, then got a PhD from Columbia. He was brilliant, idealistic as a young man, and genuinely passionate about public parks. His early career was in civil service reform, trying to fix the corrupt, patronage-bloated government of New York State. His first major achievement was one of his best. Jones Beach State Park opened in 1929. Moses took a swampy, inaccessible barrier island off the south shore of Long Island and turned it into a magnificent public beach. With bathhouses, parking, carefully landscaped parkways leading to it, it was, by almost any measure, a genuine gift to the public. And then something curdled. As Moses accumulated power, and he accumulated it methodically, stacking titles and positions until he held 12 simultaneous government posts at his peak, the idealism calcified into arrogance. The man who built parks for the public came to see the public as an obstacle. The planner who cleared land for highways stopped seeing the people who lived on it. To understand how that happened, you have to understand how Moses got his power in the first place. Moses' genius wasn't design. It wasn't even engineering. It was institutional. He figured out how to make himself structurally irreplaceable and structurally unaccountable. The key was the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which Moses ran from 1934 until 1968. Tolls from Triborough bridges generated enormous revenue that Moses controlled, that was not subject to the normal city budget process, and that he could use to fund new projects, hire staff, lobby legislators, and reward allies. He turned a toll authority into a private empire with public money. He also wrote the legislation that governed his own agencies, inserting clauses that made it nearly impossible to remove him. When governors and mayors tried to fire him, they discovered they couldn't, or that the cost was too high. He knew where every political body was buried. He had relationships with the banks, the unions, the press. He made himself the only person who could navigate the thicket he had built. Robert Caro spent years documenting all of this in his 1974 biography, The Power Broker. Still one of the most important books ever written about American cities. Caro's central argument is that Moses didn't just build things. He demonstrated how power in a democracy could be concentrated and used without any democratic check, if the architecture of institutions was designed correctly. That lesson, Caro argues, outlasted Moses himself. Moses built 13 expressways through New York City. To do it, he displaced an estimated 250,000 people, more than any other builder in American history. And the routes were not chosen neutrally. The Cross Bronx Expressway is the most infamous example. Completed in 1963, it cut directly through the heart of the Bronx, demolishing a densely populated working-class neighborhood called East Tremont. There were alternatives, routes that would have displaced far fewer people, sometimes by shifting the highway just a block or two. Moses chose the route that destroyed the most, and the reason, Caro argues, was partly indifference and partly something darker. Moses regarded poor and non-white communities as sacrifice zones. Their neighborhoods were, in his view, not really worth preserving. This wasn't unique to New York. Across the country, as the Federal Interstate Highway Program built out its 40,000-mile network after 1956, planners used Moses's playbook. Routes were drawn through black neighborhoods, through low-income communities, through areas that lacked the political connections to fight back. In city after city, Nashville, New Orleans, Minneapolis, Miami, the highway didn't go around the neighborhood. It went through it. The consequences were not temporary. When the highway went in, the neighborhood around it lost value, lost population, lost businesses, lost the tax base needed to maintain schools and services. The highway didn't just cut the neighborhood in half physically, it cut it off from the economic circulation of the city. Decades later, those scars are still visible in the poverty maps of American cities. One of the most repeated stories about Moses is the one about the bridges. Caro claimed that Moses deliberately built the overpasses on his Long Island parkways too low for buses, 9 feet clearance in some cases, so that the beaches and parks they led to would be inaccessible to poor and Black New Yorkers, who were more likely to depend on public transit. This story has been challenged by later researchers. Some of the bridges were built to accommodate other constraints. The historical evidence for deliberate racial intent on the bridges specifically is contested, and it's worth saying that clearly, because the temptation with a figure like Moses, who did do genuinely terrible things, is to accept every accusation uncritically. But here's what isn't contested. Moses' parks and pools were in practice deeply segregated, through management policy if not always physical design. He hired staff who turned away Black visitors. He kept public transit connections to white beaches minimal. He built facilities in Black neighborhoods that were deliberately inferior. The bridge story may be apocryphal in its specifics. The segregation is documented fact. Moses met his match in Jane Jacobs. The story of their conflict is one of the great David and Goliath stories in American urban history. Jacobs was not a planner or an architect. She was a journalist and a mother who lived in Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan. In 1961, she published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a direct assault on the planning orthodoxies that Moses embodied. Where Moses saw density as a problem to be cleared, Jacob saw it as the source of urban vitality. Where he saw old buildings as blight, she saw them as affordable space for small businesses and diverse communities. Where he saw highways as progress, she saw them as the destruction of the social fabric that makes cities livable. Moses wanted to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway, LOMEX, a 10-lane elevated highway that would have cut through Soho and Little Italy, demolishing hundreds of buildings and displacing thousands of residents. Jacobs organized the opposition. She showed up at hearings, she mobilized neighbors, she made the case publicly and relentlessly that this highway would kill the neighborhood rather than help it. She won. LOMEX was never built. It was one of the first times Moses was stopped, and it marked the beginning of the end of his power. By 1968, Nelson Rockefeller had finally managed to ease him out of his last major position. The era of the unchecked highway builder was over, in New York at least. In most of the rest of the country, the damage was already done. Moses' physical legacy is enormous and specific to New York, but his institutional legacy is national. He showed a generation of planners, engineers, and politicians that highways could be built through cities fast, using federal money over community objections with minimal democratic accountability, if you structured the institutions correctly and moved before opposition could organize. That playbook was replicated everywhere. The highway program of the 1950s and 60s destroyed neighborhoods in nearly every major American city. And in almost every case, the communities most harmed were the least powerful. The poor, the Black, the non-English speaking, those whose political connections were weakest. Some of those highways are now being reconsidered. San Francisco tore down the Embarcadero Freeway after the 1989 earthquake and discovered the waterfront underneath. Syracuse is capping I-81. Buffalo removed the Skyway. New Orleans is debating the Claiborne Expressway, which destroyed what was once called the Harlem of the South. These are not small projects. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars to undo what cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. The bill for Moses' choices and the choices of everyone who followed his model is still being paid. Robert Moses is one of those historical figures who resists easy judgment. He built things that genuinely improved people's lives. Parks, beaches, bridges, housing. He operated in an era when slum clearance was mainstream policy, celebrated by reformers across the political spectrum. He was a product of his time, even as he shaped it. But the scale of what he destroyed, not just the buildings, but communities, networks, trust, possibility, demands to be named clearly. 250,000 people displaced in New York alone. Neighborhoods across America severed, impoverished, written off. Decades of accumulated social capital bulldozed in the name of traffic flow. The deepest lesson of Moses isn't really about highways. It's about power without accountability. When any single person or institution can make decisions of enormous consequence for hundreds of thousands of people without meaningful democratic check, the results tend to reflect the values and blind spots of that person, not the needs of those affected. The cities he shaped still show it. In the next video, we're going to meet the woman who pushed back hardest against everything Moses built, Jane Jacobs, and what her vision for cities actually looked like. As always, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you then.